intelligencesquared.com.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to all of you for coming. As John explained, I think this was an event brought together very hastily at very short notice, so we're hugely grateful for the people who are here. It does remind me slightly of the guest speaker who was booked in to do a lecture 2 years hence and was asked by the organisers what he would be giving as his title for his talk some 2 years away, and he said, well, how could I possibly know what I'll be talking about? And then he said, hold on a minute, I know exactly what will work. I'll be speaking about the current crisis in the Middle East. And it is normally a very, very safe bet. Tonight we're talking about something which is, I suppose, to a handful of people, those dictators who are seeing their regimes crumbling, a crisis, perhaps something different for everyone else. The subject before us, turmoil in the Arab world, is the genie of democracy out of the bottle. Now, Intelligence Squared regulars will be anticipating perhaps our traditional debate format. As John suggested, we're not going down that road tonight. Instead, we have, as you can see, an embarrassment of riches here, a set of very expert analysts, scholars, reporters on the region. And the way we're going to do it is divide the topic into 4 themes. Each one of those will be addressed initially in an opening set of remarks from one speaker, then there'll be a response, perhaps for 3 or 4 minutes, from another speaker, and then we're going to open it out both here, here at this table, and then once we've got through those 4, we'll then broaden out into the wider discussion. I've been very firm with our speakers and told them we want to maximize the amount of time we get to hear these voices here rather than at this end of the room. So I'm hoping to be quite strict on that, or assuming I will be, to make sure we stick to time. And 2 other sort of notes to mention. One is that Sir Malcolm Rifkind has had to pull out of this evening's discussion, so he won't be here. But joining us from Washington will be, technology permitting, Edward Lutwak. He's been gazing upon our deliberations throughout, but now has been replaced by a question mark, which almost fits the unknown quality of the events in the Middle East as they are unfolding. So, before we get plunged into the discussion, it would be always very good to get a litmus test of feeling in the room. Normally with a debate, you can vote on the motion, but here it's a much more unscientific exercise. We'll just do a show of hands, just to gauge what the mood of the room is. Those who are essentially, with whatever caveats, but essentially optimistic about developments now unfolding in the Middle East, please raise your hand. Okay, and those who are pessimistic? I think the optimists just have it very slightly, but it's very slight. The room is pretty well evenly divided. So the optimists on this table will be seeking to persuade and get bigger numbers by the end of the evening. The pessimists will hope, although of course they don't hope for such things, but they'll hope to get more hands showing their side. So we'll see how it gets going. I'm always reminded of the people in the Middle East who say that no one ever lost money betting pessimistically on the Middle East. But let's hope that is not true. So let's go straight into our first theme, which is what kind of revolution are we witnessing? What kind of revolution? What were particularly in Egypt, the key factors that led to his downfall? How was it organized? Was it more, it's ongoing, but more about abstract ideals of freedom and democracy, or more about food and jobs and those brass tacks matters? And why did the army refuse to shoot at the protesters and use force? And what will happen with the new military council, the generals who rule now? So to start us off on that, the first of our speakers, Eugene Rogan, is the director of the Middle East Center at Oxford University and the author of The Arabs' History, and he will start us off on that. And once you've done that, I'll introduce the next speaker and perhaps the others too. But why don't you start us off, Eugene?
Very good, Jonathan, with pleasure. All of that in 6 minutes. Here we go. There's been a funny tone to the press coverage about recent events. A lot of the journalists have not been comfortable talking about a revolution in Tunisia or in Egypt. And so I think my first point tonight is to say this is absolutely a revolutionary moment. This is the revolutionary year of 2011. What is distinctive about the revolutions of 2011 what makes them truly 21st century revolutions, unlike anything we've seen before, is the way in which they have been mobilized through the use of the computer. And these are really computer revolutions. They don't emerge in any sense out of a vacuum. If we think specifically to Egypt, I would certainly argue that the antecedents of the movements we've seen this year take us back at least to the emergence of the Kifaya movement in 2004. It was a movement that brought together many of the same political forces that have characterized the 25 January movement. But what it took for those early demonstrations of a few hundred, a couple thousand, to reach the critical mass that could really be a movement to change things was the power of the internet. You have to remember, in Egypt, it is against the law for more than 3 people to gather around a political cause. You can be arrested for that. We know that there are salons. Ala el-Aswani holds his Thursday salon, so he has more than 3 people talking politics at a time. But nonetheless, the scope for repression is real. And what the social networking software allows you to do is to assemble masses of people who can talk to each other in relative freedom, not total. Journalists from Cairo have told me about individuals being arrested and tortured to find out who the friends on their Facebook sites were. And so there still was fear in using Facebook pages. It wasn't totally free. But this allowed the numbers to go beyond what really any one individual could know all the names of, what any security apparatus could really control. And so starting in the aftermath of Kifaya, it's really when all of these disenchanted young activists begin to take to the blogs and then create Facebook pages. You had the emergence of the April 6th movement in 2008 as a real network of computer-linked people. And then really the way in which that movement gets into dialogue with similar people in Tunisia, also mobilized through Facebook to try to trade notes about what it takes to take on the regime. So that when, ironically enough, the Egyptian activists wanted to organize demonstrations to mark the 25th of January, Police Day, which is the day when the police held their station in Ismailia against determined British resistance in 1952 and suffered scores of dead in fighting to the last man. And in the aftermath of that, we saw one of the great moments of Egyptian political activism. They burned Cairo on the 26th of January. They chose that day, Police Day, to see if they could get 50,000 people on a Facebook group named in honor of a man murdered by the police in Egypt, Khalid Said, Kulena Khalid Said website. And they found that not only 50,000 signed up to demonstrate, but 100,000. And they knew they'd reached critical mass. And that was critical. Safety in numbers. This is a revolution that only takes place where numbers allow the demonstrators to be more than the security forces can contain. Critical part of what worked in Tunisia and what worked in Egypt. But to get those numbers, it took a face. And here again, we come back to the individuals whose personal tragedies really inspired these movements to take off. It was the vegetable vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, that really lay behind the integration of the Tunisian movement. And it was, in a very real sense, the beating to death of computer engineer Khalid Said in Alexandria that galvanized the people of Egypt to say no to politics of terror. They needed an individual they could relate to. And saying, we are all Khalid Said, as the Facebook site does, implicates every Egyptian in a common position of resistance against the forces of oppression. So that's the kind of revolution we're dealing with. The questions of whether this is a revolution of freedom versus one of economic complaints, I would argue it's both. On the one hand, the regimes were brutal, and they sought dynastic succession. Not only did you have a terrible president, but that president wanted to perpetuate his rule through passing rule on to his son, or in the case of Tunisia, according to rumor, to his wife. What it really showed is the degree to which Egyptian and Tunisian rulers underestimated the sophistication of their own people. They misread what their people would be willing to accept. Anyone who has read Ala el-Aswani's columns in his Shuruq knows that Egyptian intellectuals have been arguing against succession, for the need for free and open elections, and for broadening of the political arena. Aswani's signature in all of his pieces is democracy is the solution, and this since 2005. So don't underestimate your own people. They want their freedom and they'll demand it. But also, there is an economic motive. Those bad, brutal regimes had also failed to deliver economically. They had a young population for whom they provided neither jobs nor housing, no future, no stake in the future. And so it's quite logical to expect in the pressure cooker of frustrations that an intelligent, informed, and frustrated populace is going to reject the regime that's not delivering. So I would say it was natural to demand freedom from corrupt elites that have failed to deliver. Now, I'm down to my last minute. And the question really is, where are we going from here? And the question really is whether the generals are a force of liberation or a return to military rule. Had you asked me as an analyst of the situation, the last thing I wanted to see was the military come to power. And I have grave reservations about the way they will oversee a transition to civilian rule. The thing to remember about the military is it is one of the most powerful interest groups in Egypt. And their decision not to back President Mubarak was far more conditioned to their preserving their own interests than it was about upholding the rights of the people. And I think that that must be borne in mind as one thinks about the timetable the generals have set. A lot to accomplish in the next 6 months. 10 days to try and draft the revisions to the Constitution, 2 months to hold a referendum on that Constitution, and 6 months to elections. Being an American, I'm used to elections taking a good year to prepare for. The British do it in a couple of months, but the Egyptians have quite a lot on their plate. So toppling the dictator is certainly part one of the revolution, but making the enduring institutions of a new democratic order is a challenge that will be needed to fulfill the potential of this revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask in a moment Nabila Ramdani to respond. I also want to just introduce all of the remaining panelists, just so you know where this is going, and also to tell you what the other subjects we're going to be covering are, just because I know sometimes people get very pent up waiting for certain topics to come, so I'm going to reassure you that they're on their way. So first of all, let me just mention who else is here and introduce them. We're going to hear next from Nabila Ramdani, who's a Paris-born journalist of Algerian descent who specializes in Islamic affairs and the Arab world. On my immediate right here is Tariq Ramadan, Professor of Islamic Studies and Senior Research Fellow at St Antony's College, Oxford. On my immediate left here, Denise Candiotti, Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Immediately to her left, just in from Cairo, is Roger Cohen, columnist for the New York Times and editor-at-large for the International Herald Tribune. And at the end of the table, Rosemary Hollis, who's Professor of Middle East Policy Studies and Director of the Olive Tree Scholarship Programme at the City University in London. And on screen, waiting very patiently for us, Edward Lutwak, a strategist, historian, and Senior Associate at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Nabila is going to respond on this point. We then will, in the same format of speaker and respondent, discuss the question of Israel. We will then move on to the role of the Islamists, a final section on the West's reaction, and then, as I say, we're going to open it up to everyone. So I just wanted to let you know where we're going with this. Hold the thoughts that we had from Professor Rogan in your mind as we get a response to them from Nabila Ramdani.
Thank you very much. As a journalist, I work all over the Arab world, and as an academic, I am currently writing a thesis on the Egyptian revolution of 1919. So just like Eugene, I'm particularly interested in historical parallels and indeed in the media revolution that's happening in the region. By the time Britain granted Egypt nominal independence in 1922, all sections of society were celebrating their own part in achieving liberation. Pamphleteers and the burgeoning popular press had all played a role in bringing them together to campaign for change. This sense of a single people uniting against their oppressor is the one which is sustaining the sweep towards democracy in the Arab world today. And I certainly have a qualified optimism about this. Arab people are uniting to fight for the fundamentals: jobs, housing, human rights. In other words, a vibrant economy and a democratic future. Their intention is to use the tools of the modern world to prosper. It's fitting, therefore, that huge advances in the worldwide media have inspired, mobilized, and in some ways won the largely peaceful revolution that we've seen so far. The Egyptian uprising is already being called the Facebook revolution because it was in essence organized by hundreds of thousands of internet friends. They didn't just place a like next to calls for action either. They went out on the street and joined the crowds. Social networking sites were used to bring people together in a manner which would have been unimaginable at the beginning of the 20th century. These sites are today used to provide images and moving testaments of what it's really like to be at the center of a population inspired to political action. While overseas revolutions were, by definition, once distant, abstract affairs, we can now all get an idea of what they really mean by simply turning on our laptops and smartphones. We must not underestimate the importance of 24-hour news channels in all this either. They're relatively new, certainly in historical terms, but they've had a huge influence. One wonders how far the revolution would have got if broadcasters had not moved their journalists and equipment in so quickly. It's certainly no coincidence that now deposed dictators like Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt put huge efforts into suppressing both new and old media. These range from reporters and cameramen being attacked and at times even kidnapped and bureaus ransacked to internet service providers being shut down. Such repression patently didn't work, however, and the media will now play a huge part in creating democratic institutions in both Egypt and Tunisia. As the spirit of revolution spreads to other parts of the Arab world, those in charge of the mass global media will only be too aware of the huge influence they have. There will be enormous problems in the years ahead in all the Arab states. Just as the British influence continued to dominate Egypt's political and economic life long after the nominally successful 1919 revolution, so we have to fear the legacy of autocrats like Mubarak and Ben Ali. There will be numerous attempts to reimpose autocracies dominated by self-styled leaders of the people. However, the biggest historical change highlighted by revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia is that these people are nowadays hugely well-informed, questioning, and technologically savvy. And this should be our greatest cause for optimism as we consider the future of the Arab world.
Thank you. Very good, thank you for that. Let's just use the few minutes we have on this topic just to hear some other voices. I'm tempted to go to you, Roger Cohen, right away, because you're hot foot from Cairo. We were asking this question, what were the key factors that led to the toppling of Mubarak, and to what extent was this about freedom and democracy, or rather about bread and butter? Can you shed some light on that? Just in a
well, I thought, good evening, everyone. I thought Eugene's point about the power of the new social media was absolutely right. I mean, this will be studied for years as, I think, a textbook case of web-savvy, nimble, young people linked through Facebook and Twitter, and a hierarchical organization, Mubarak and his autocracy, that just proved completely unable to move fast enough and were wrong-footed all the time. And there was Mubarak locked in the prison of his formal Arabic. I'm not an Arabist myself, but everybody tells me that his speeches were full of these tremendously formal Arabic phrases. And the square, Tahrir, was full of these jokes, these colloquialisms that were winging out on the web at any moment. And I think the turning point, because there was a moment in this very up and down 2 weeks that I've just come back from, there was a moment when it seemed Mubarak might prevail. And I would say the turning point is when Wael Ghonim, the Google executive who was disappeared in good Mubarak style for 12 days, when he reappeared and he tweeted, and I think these are more or less the exact words, he tweeted, "Freedom is a bless worth fighting for." I imagine those words will be engraved in granite on some memorial in Egypt one day. That re-electrocuted the square and set things moving again.
Thank you very much. Others who want to weigh in on this, about what the revolution was about, if you like. Denise Kanjotti, do you want to say something about that?
particularly, except for the fact that I discovered to my great amazement that the big source of inspiration was a certain Gene Sharp, who I'd never heard about, who was a proponent of nonviolent protest, and that some of the young people who were based around this movement had paid a visit to Otpor, the Serbian youth movement that had unseated Milosevic. So I thought this was an eclectic set of influences, to say the least.
Fascinating. What about the question of what the military council, the military rulers of the country do now? Rosemary Hollis, can you give us any thought? It's speculation, I know, but what might be the next move?
Well, I know everybody's been saying that this was completely unexpected, but I think a lot of Egyptians were worried about what comes after Mubarak, because they anticipated he would die at least, as opposed to being ousted. And there was much speculation several years ago about whether the army would accept Gamal Mubarak as a successor. And the fact that he wasn't a military man would give them pause. The fact that, therefore, he might be weak could make him acceptable, might not. But I think the thing to watch here, therefore, is whether they, too, along with the ordinary Egyptian people, bridled at the idea that a Republican president had turned into a monarch, a dynasty.
One thing, actually, that was worrying Egyptians is that Mubarak's father apparently lived to 105. So.
Tariq Ramadan has a question. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But Edward Lutwak, if you're able to hear us, I know we're going to come to you soon about Israel, but do you have anything, the sort of view from Washington on some of the discussion we've been having so far? No, we'll get there. We'll turn up the volume, I'm sure. Hold on, we're not hearing you just yet, but we will. Is there anything we can do? I'm looking upward at the technical maestros. Let's have a look.
He doesn't know we can't hear.
Not yet. Well, we'll regard this as a practice run for your moment later.
I'm going to go on.
There we are. I think I hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now I can, and now we all can. So
Good.
Please go ahead.
All right. First of all, forgive me if I don't celebrate technology with the other speakers. I would much rather be standing there in that room and shouting rather than to use all these contraptions here. The second thing, forgive me if I don't celebrate technology as they do, because I recall reading at one point, I actually studied history briefly. I don't know, it was 1066 and all that, telling me that in 1848, revolutions spread right across Europe and changed governments. And even when the power reestablished itself, they had to change the rules and behave much more democratically. Revolution spread in 1848, when I believe Facebook was very poorly developed as yet. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no internet, no CNN, no Al Jazeera, and revolution spread. I believe that the mechanism is a much more fundamental one than simply the belief that technology changes things. Something else must have changed, not just the technology. If the technology were the actor, then we would see revolution in Syria, where the Assad dictatorship is a complete economic failure, unlike Mubarak, under whom Egypt did have quite a lot of economic growth, or Gaddafi.
What a shame. The machine has stopped in mid-flow. I'm going to stop you
We
there.
should see those places to do it twice over. So I believe that what happened in Tunisia was a Tunisian phenomenon, and Egypt an Egyptian phenomenon. Speakers have already pointed out how these people took the initiative and reached out and so on.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We're going to pick up some of those points. Tariq Ramadan had a question, which I think you're going to put, and then we're going to move on to our next topic.
Yes, but this is a question about the army, because I think you said something which is quite important about the interest of the army. What we got from Tunisia, and this is something which was said at the highest level in France, is that the decision for Ben Ali to get rid of him and for him to leave the country, and even the role of the army was decided not only in Tunisia, but in connection with the American administration and the foreign minister and the army commandment in Tunisia not to take side. And it is strange that we had exactly the same position in Egypt. So my question is, because the future is really going to be about the role of the army, how can we understand this? Because still now, this position and getting contradictions and contradictory statements from within the army is a question mark. What is really the role, and how do you analyze this? Because I don't think it's only interests from within. I think it's a regional also phenomenon.
Okay, that's a question for Eugene Rogan.
And should we take those now, Jonathan?
Just that one from Tariq, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really valid point. And one of the difficulties we all have is that we're coming to meet Egypt's military hierarchy, who are by and large strangers to us. You might have heard of Tantawi before, but this higher council, I know very few people who even knew of its existence. It apparently met very seldom. I think that the military is seen as being the most stable institution after the fall of the NDP and the Mubarak government to preserve great power interests in the region, whether that's the peace with Israel or regional stability. And that might have a lot to do with it as well, above and beyond the question of the interests of the military.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned there, Professor Rogan, the subject of peace with Israel, and that's where we're going to move on to. The Muslim Brotherhood, I think best organized, as I understand it, best organized political movement in the country, have said that if they gain influence in Egypt, the reported have said they would rescind the peace treaty with Israel. How should Israel react? How is Israel likely to react? And would perhaps the Israelis like to see the army, the military council we've just been hearing about, stay in charge rather than be subject to the fickle winds of democracy? So that's the topic in this next second section of our discussion. We are, technology permitting, going to begin with 4 or 5 minutes from Washington with Edward Luttwak, mindful, Edward, that you have somewhere to be in Washington very soon. So we'll begin with you if we can.
I hope you can hear me because I cannot see you.
We can hear you.
Very good. Okay, first of all, because Mr. Mubarak was supported by the United States, he could not shoot on his population. That is the penalty you pay if the Americans support you. But certainly, from the Israeli point of view, the situation has never changed since before 1948. Namely, Israel has always functioned democratically. It did so even before there was a state, because the Jewish community organized itself by elections and parties and so on. And it has been waiting for the emergence of democracies in the Arab world. Notwithstanding the fact of what happened with one election in Gaza that got in Hamas, primarily because of corruption. And of course, Hamas, if there was an election today, they would lose again. Notwithstanding this experience, the Israelis have been waiting patiently for the breaking out of democracy in the Arab world. So from their point of view, Mubarak was a stable government, but a government that gave them only a cold peace and a precarious peace because it was not a democratically determined peace. Now, from their point of view, of course, their fundamental facts are that the population of Israel has increased by 12 times since 1948, which is more than any other country in the world. If China had grown at the Israeli rate, then China would really be a big country today, of the order of 10 billion people. Its gross national product, its economy, has grown by a factor of 100. And therefore, or 100, and just in the last 5 years, since the Lebanon War of 2006, the economy has grown by a quarter almost. So from an economic, structural, social point of view, Israel is very strong. And militarily, it faces essentially noisy threats like Hezbollah, with his rockets and so on. If they launch the rockets, there will be some damage and there will be the end of Hezbollah because they will not be anymore tickled by air power and little bit inconvenienced by little bombing, but there will be a proper military action. They are, after all, only a few thousand people, salaried people, and perfectly well-trained combatants and so on. However, the Israelis don't have a few thousand. They have a few tens of thousands just in terms of first-rate infantry they can send in. So the Israelis are not feeling insecure. They have no reason to feel insecure. And looking back on Mubarak, yes, stability, but also a cold peace. A peace where Egypt would go and turn to other countries, for example, even when they wanted help with arid zone farming, desert farming. So you have Israeli technical people working in North China to deal with the desertification of the Yellow River Basin, but they're not working in Egypt. So the cold peace they've had from Mubarak may be replaced by a colder peace, if to the extent that the Muslim Brotherhood has any influence, or people like them. But that will again not make a difference, because the fundamental strategic situation of the Middle East is the same as before. Namely, it's no longer the center of world politics. It's not the pivot, not the arena of confrontation between the superpowers. That's moved many thousands of miles to the east. And it has become a sort of strategic backwater. In this strategic backwater, the dominant voice and sound are the Iranians, the truculent, kleptocratic priests who rule Iran, who threaten, first of all, the governments of Kuwait, Qatar, Abu Dhabi. They even have a territorial conflict with Abu Dhabi, and of course the Saudi monarchy, and of course Sunnidom in general, because their Shiism is a messianic one. Just the other day, Ahmadinejad, my favorite former mayor of Tehran, stated that it was the 12th Imam himself who organized, it wasn't Twitter apparently, it was the 12th Imam that organized the demonstrations in Cairo. Now, in this Middle East, peopled by absolutist monarchs, by dictators, by the sons of dictators, Bashar Assad in Syria, who presides over the paralysis and immobility of Syrian life. And in this kind of Middle East, a democracy, however imperfect, however roughly emerging, even if you like less stable or less cooperative than Mubarak, will nevertheless be very welcomed by the Israeli democracy. There's no doubt about it. And it's been, as I say, they've been waiting for decades to see a democratic government. And one of the the parameters of Israeli life was that from Morocco to India, what you have is sometimes elections, like in Pakistan, and you have no democracies. Okay. That has very big strategic implications, because it means that these governments can spend their money on frivolity, whether it's the golden bathrooms and doorknobs of the Kuwaiti Amir, or it is the many dozens of full-size passenger airliners that must be at the service as executive jets of even middle-ranking members of the Saudi royal family and all the rest of it. These are very expensive governments, and one of the luxuries they've been able to afford for themselves is hostility towards Israel.
Edward, I'm going to interrupt you there because the line is beginning to break up a little bit. Thank you very much for that contribution. There's lots there for us to bite on. If you're able to stay around and hear the responses and perhaps come back just at the end of the very short discussion. Listening to that is Roger Cohen, as I said, back from Cairo, but somebody who's written extensively about the region. The message from Edward Luttwak is that this is a strategic backwater and that actually, I think, fairly relaxed. The most dangerous prospect is that a cold peace could become a colder peace. Do you share that relaxed position, or do you think one possibility is even war?
I don't share that relaxed position. I think the Middle East remains a strategic epicenter. We've had wars, after all, in Lebanon and Gaza in the last, small wars, but still wars in the last few years. So I think to be blithely dismissive of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a kind of sideshow to the main issues of contemporary times, I think is wrong. There are a couple of things, although I do share Ed's, I hope it's genuine that Israel feels fairly secure about what's going on in Egypt. I think it should feel that. I'd like to say, first of all, that this was not, on Tahrir Square, you could hear discussions of all kinds of things. You could hear debates about democracy, about religion, about the Brotherhood, about Mubarak, about Gamal. The one thing it was not about was Israel. Nobody wanted to talk about Israel. And in fact, the one time that a chant went up saying something like, we will liberate Egypt and then we'll liberate Palestine, it was immediately whistled down. This is not what Egyptians are focused on. They're focused on building some kind of decent representative society in Egypt. I was intrigued to hear Ed say that, Israel's been sitting around waiting for democracies to emerge. That's really what Israel's been doing for 60 plus years, because if that's the case, then why did Prime Minister Netanyahu really only along with Saudi Arabia rush to Mubarak's defense? To be fair to Netanyahu, he said things on both sides of the question, but he was much more of the opinion that we should regard events in Egypt as a potential rerun of Tehran 1979, in other words, a revolution for freedom that gets hijacked by the Islamists, than as a kind of Berlin 1989, a democratic flowering going across the Arab world. I'm more in the second school. Why should Israel, as I said, feel elements of confidence? Well, I think one is that Egypt is, unlike Iraq, unlike Lebanon, it's the oldest nation state on earth. There is no major sectarian divide within Egypt. It has, at the price of $1.3 billion a year, acquired what seemed to me to be a very professional army. I was in Tehran in June 2009, and believe me, the Egyptian army on the streets of Cairo these past weeks were a very welcome presence when compared to the Basiji and the Rev Guards rampaging through the streets of Tehran, beating, killing, gassing, whoever. The army managed in a very professional way, I think, to avert that. And through the army, of course, there will be US influence on what emerges in Egypt. There's quite a large middle class in Egypt. And finally, there have been 40 years, almost, and let's give Mubarak some credit for that, there's been almost 40 years of peace in Egypt. That's very important. When you have a society like Iran, like Lebanon, that's been ravaged by war, the desire for vengeance, the divisions in society, they are extremely deep, extremely profound, and can cause great disruptions. That is not the case in Egypt. So for that reason, I would feel fairly positive. Now, Israel, I think there's an element of, hypocrisy in the Israeli focus on the Muslim Brotherhood. After all, there are extremely orthodox religious parties like Shas in Israel. One of the great virtues of democracies is that they can absorb extreme religious parties within the panoply of parties that exist.
Roger, can I just come in on that specific point? Because I suppose the argument would be those religious parties in Israel wouldn't say, as we hear the Muslim Brotherhood has been quoted as saying, they want to rescind the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. They'll just focus on that little bit, this idea that if the Muslim Brotherhood was to have any decisive say in Egyptian politics, do you think that there's a legitimate concern that they might want to tear up that peace treaty?
Well, I didn't hear anybody in Cairo from the Muslim Brotherhood say they wanted to rescind the treaty. On the contrary, they were saying they weren't even going to put in a presidential candidate because they think stability is so important for the period to come. So I would be very skeptical of that. Look, the Brotherhood's been around a long time, and they've had to live, and Eugene knows a lot more about this than I do, but they've had to live with the give and take of Mubarak's odd game with them for a long time, and I think they've become a pretty pragmatic party. I think Israel also has to look, and I'll conclude with this, the mystical religious project in Israel, the idea of Eretz Israel, of Greater Israel, of Judea and Samaria, it's there. It still exists. Netanyahu has come grudgingly to two states for two peoples. But that decision has not been made. As we speak here tonight, the settlements continue to expand. So I think Israel should be wary of talking of the dangers of religion, religious fundamentalism, so long as that mystical religious project continues to play such an important part in Israeli life.
Thank you. Thank you. we've only got a minute or two allocated to this topic if we're to get through everything. Before I go back for a concluding few seconds from Edward Luttwak, are there anybody else on the panel who wants to weigh in on this particular point? Why don't you get us going? Eugene Roken, yeah.
The point I wanted to raise is the question of complacency, really. I mean, there is a bit of a crisis here for Israel, whether we agree on that or not. I think all these years it's been reliant on cold peace treaties and dictators to keep stability, and that's all about to change. But a crisis can bring about an opportunity too. Israel's not going anywhere. It's in the Middle East. It's going to have to adapt its policies to sit more comfortably in the Middle East. I wonder whether there might not be scope for the revolutions in the Arab world to force Israel to take a more realistic policy along the lines of perhaps the Arab League Peace Initiative.
Thank you. Ms. Rosemary, do you want to come in on this?
Well, I'm surprised that both Edward and Roger are saying that the Israelis are fairly relaxed, because it's not only, or perhaps Roger didn't say he thought they were fairly relaxed because he mentioned some of the things that Netanyahu has said, but I thought there was quite a lot of dire warnings coming out of Israel, quite a lot of discomfort. And I think there's reason for that discomfort, and not because the Egyptians are going to take up the cause of the Palestinians in terms of liberating Palestine or scrapping the treaty. It's just that they feel no warmth and quite a lot of hostility to Israel, and have no tolerance for the continued occupation or blockade of the Palestinians. And if this revolution is about freedom, absence of oppression, bringing down the kind of governments that suppress freedom of the press and so on in the name of security, then it would be contradictory to that to continue to condone an occupation.
Thank you. We are in the business of trying to win over people to the optimist-pessimist debate. Is there anybody who thinks it's possible, Edward Luttwak warned that a cold peace could be replaced by a colder peace, that if the Egyptian people have their own say, they may, over a period perhaps even of decades, eventually want a warmer peace with their neighbour? I just put that question out there. Nabila, why don't you give whatever reaction you would like, and we'll go back to Edward for a final comment.
Well, first of all, the first point I'd like to make is that Israel is, of course, a democracy, and as such, its citizens are enjoying basic human and fundamental human rights, well, except for the Palestinian minority within Israel. But the fact that Israel should be worried in having a democratic neighbour is truly annoying. Now, you've mentioned the worries about the Israeli leaders to see the peace agreement, to see whether or not the peace agreement with Egypt will survive. In my opinion, treaties are not unconditional. Alliances historically are done and undone, and I don't think that, frankly, Egyptians are interested in seeing and engaging in a war with Israel. They have much more on their plate at the moment, and I don't think that's the concern of any political group at the moment, and including the Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you. Edward, you've waited patiently. You've heard lots of contributions there. Do you want to just react to some of them?
First, I hear people saying that the Israelis are terribly worried, and then constructing things on that argument. However, I was there last week, and I heard the Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff, former Chief of Staff, ex-Chief of Staff, the former Chief of Staff's wife and cousin and nephews all saying the same thing, that they anticipate no danger of war from Egypt under any possible government that could emerge in Egypt that would be remotely democratic, given the priorities that any democratic government would have. So this is imaginary. On the other hand, I'm not surprised that it is a Mr. Cohen. A Mr. Cohen, it's always a Cohen or a Levy or some such thing, who is very worried about the Israeli religious project, as he calls it. The fact of the matter is that the Israeli project was always a project that it was not within the realistic terms of international politics. Within international political realism, Israel would not have existed. And what has happened from the beginning to the present is, of course, that others had to bend to the reality created by Israel. And that will continue to be the case. Finally, on regard to whether the Middle East is important or not, the Sixth Fleet used to have as many as 60 warships in the Mediterranean, 60 warships, the Sixth Fleet. Today, it has an old command ship, which is still moored in Naples so that a few admirals can eat some spaghetti alle vongole, the real ones, because the American fleet is in the Pacific. That tells you all you want to know about the strategic importance of the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you leaving us now, Professor Ludwig, or are you going to be able to carry on? I just want to know if you're... I can't tell. We'll see. We'll
5
see.
minutes will run out.
Okay, we'll see by looking at the picture, I suppose. Thank you for that. Let's move on to our third topic, and it has been touched on inevitably in that discussion there we just had about Israel. The role of the Islamists, particularly focusing, obviously, on the Muslim Brotherhood. Questions before us: what degree of tolerance is the army likely to show towards the Muslim Brotherhood, the army council that now rules the country? Is the Brotherhood likely to seek alliance with secular, non-Islamist parties? Are they likely, or do they want to, does the Brotherhood want to hijack, if you like, the popular revolt and turn it into their own? And Roger Cohen has mentioned the precedent of Tehran in 1979. And will the rights of women and other minorities be endangered if the Muslim Brotherhood were to take, if not overall control, a decisive role? To kick us off is Tariq Ramadan. There'll be a response later from Denise Kanjoti, but Tariq Ramadan.
Yes, thank you. So let me, once again, it's very difficult just to tackle the issue in 6-7 minutes, but let us try to say something useful for the sake of the discussion. First, once again, we have to repeat what was said here. This is not an Islamist revolution. And we cannot just compare what was happening in Tunisia or what is happening in Egypt with what was happening in Iran. In Iran, the leadership, and it was an Islamist, it was not hijacked by Islamists. It was from the day one, it was an Islamist revolution. Now, what is clear from what we got from the Muslim Brotherhood and even from the Islamist party in Nahda in Tunisia is what they were caught by surprise. They themselves tried to find a place in the whole process, and they were trying. We got just after 4 days the Muslim Brotherhood saying, oh, our man is Baradai, because they wanted to be within. So we can think it's a strategy. What is quite clear from the very beginning is that they were not leading the movement. It was not an Islamist movement, and it was them. It was not them to. They were not hijacking anything from the very beginning, and I don't think that we can say it's only strategy. The second thing, which was quite important in all the slogans that we had, it was for the sake of Egypt, freedom, autonomy, and against the dictator. It was not against the West, it was not for Islam, and even what you said is quite important. The Islamist or any Islamic slogan was not there. So as much as we haven't heard anything against the West, we haven't heard anything about, an Islamic state or an Islamic project. And this is something which is important. Now, what is important, because this is what we got from the dictators for years. What Mubarak tried to do the first 2 days is to arrest 500 Muslim brothers, to say, this is them. And this is exactly what Ben Ali did at the beginning. He said, the Islamists are behind it, in order, once again, to sell us the story. It's either us, the dictator, or the radical Islamist. And we justified for years our support in the West to dictators by saying, better them than the Islamists. So it was again the same rhetoric, and it didn't work, because straight after they were arrested, it was quite clear that they were not leading the movement. What is clear, and this was true in Tunisia and was true in Egypt, that from within the country, they have something which is a historical legitimacy as an opposition force. That is clear, and we cannot deny this, that for 60 years they were against, Mubarak. They have been arrested under Nasser, tortured, repressed, under Nasser, under Sadat, and this is clear. But this position, this symbolic position, was not there over the 18 days of the revolution. It was not there. But what was said, first it started with the Israeli government, it started in the West, this is what we got, this we have to be scared was by the Islamists. And the second thing which is important is they were part of the movement. Once again, this is clear, they were part of the movement, not leading the movement. Now, if we look at who were the people who were involved, and once again, I think that when we speak about Islamism and Islamists, we have to be cautious. Who are we talking about? What are we describing as Islamists? And very often in the rhetoric now, it's as if we are talking about radicals and the Bin Laden thing. It's not to know what is happening, for example, in Tunisia. The first one to speak about democracy, for example, in the Islamist recent history is Ghannouchi. And Ghannouchi was here in London. He came back to Tunisia and he was saying from the beginning, I'm not going to run for presidency, I'm not going to impose anything, we accept the rule of law. And by the way, what was said by the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood from the very beginning was, we are going to respect Egyptian agreement with Israel. This was said exactly the opposite of what you are saying. It was said 5 days after the beginning of the revolution, saying we are not going to change this. So this is something which is, once again, to use them as, a threat against the revolution and not to take the revolution for what it is. Now, we have to take a position on this. We cannot just underestimate the potential threat, but we cannot overestimate it and just saying we have to take a choice between dictators and Islamists. To look at what was happening within the Islamist trend, even in Tunisia and in Egypt, is first to acknowledge the fact that over the last 30 years, they have changed a great deal, and it's not a monolithic movement. You have tensions between the first generation of people who started the movement and the second generation, and anyone who has studied the Muslim Brotherhood, even with young people who were trying to get a political party, al-Wasat, they had to leave the movement, and then you have people who are very close to it. They say, we have to look at what Erdogan is doing in Turkey, and others are very close to what is said in Saudi Arabia. And by the way, we don't have a problem with Saudi Arabia in the West. Not a problem at all. We can deal with them as long as they are protecting our interests. So we don't have a problem with some Islamists as long as these Islamists are protecting our interests. And we have to be self-critical here in the way we deal with the whole issue. We can't just keep on this very simplistic, slogans, Islamists are going to be against the West. It's not true. And literalists, Muslims, are also Islamists in the way they deal with the governance. So just to go to here to a conclusion, we have to deal with the differences and to get a sense of what is happening in the Islamist trends. And once we understand what is, first, these revolutions are not Islamist revolutions. Second, they are part of the movement, and then we need to challenge the views of the Islamists. We can't accept the people to be tortured and repression because we don't agree with the views of these people. And the mainstream Islamist groups that we are talking about in Tunisia and in Egypt are legalist, non-violent, and they are part of the system. They were not recognized officially by the government, but in Egypt they were clearly non-violent. And this is the situation. So for us now, and this is where I think it's quite important to be consistent with our view, we should stop demonizing the opposition forces and the Islamist voices in the West. If we want to be true to our principles, we can't demonize and accept, for example, what was said by Israel at the very beginning, the Netanyahu government, saying you should support Mubarak, because if not, we'll have the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is exactly the same as the Iranian regime. This is wrong. Factually, historically, scientifically, we can't accept this. It's just sending us a message that the only way to have stability in the region is to surround Israel with dictatorships. That cannot be the situation for the future. The last point for me is, once again, if we are serious with our own principles, we challenge the people. What is your view on Sharia? I have lots of questions about, some of the Islamists and the way they deal with Sharia and the way they understand Sharia. What do we mean when we speak about implementing Sharia, Islamic State, women, minorities? But we challenge them and we ask for a democratic process to let them be part of the democratic debates and not just to accept them to be oppressed. And the last point that I wanted to make here for us also in our understanding is it's a very critical decision that we have to take. Now, what happened during years in the Middle East is dictators repressing Islamists. And the only thing which is coming out of repression is radicalization, not at all, getting rid of the phenomenon. We are not going to get rid of anything which has to do with political Islam by repressing the people, by challenging them and abiding by our own principles.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just to clarify that exchange we were just having there about the statement about Muslim Brotherhood intentions vis-à-vis Israel, I think it was a spokesman in London, actually, who was quoted saying that the peace treaty would be in jeopardy, but I agree there were other statements that pointed in other directions, but there was one report of that, okay, and it came out of London. Denise Kanjosi, let's have a reaction from you, ideally in 3 or 4 minutes if we can, so that we can get to the larger...
Well, I will start by completely agreeing with Tariq on the question of hijacking. And I will also completely agree on this business of the bogeyman of Muslim fundamentalism put up by so-called secular regimes, because I'm going to argue here that we were not dealing with secular regimes at all. Egypt, sociologically, when we look at it, was an extremely corrupt regime that had enlisted conservative Islamism as a means to contain and to neutralize more radical tendencies. In fact, it would be laughable to define this regime as secular because state courts were passing routine sentences of takfir, apostasy, on people like Hamid Nasr Abu Zaid, who was forcibly divorced from his own wife on the grounds that he was an apostate. The question then becomes, how much further do Islamic forms of control, with their attendant limitations for the rights of women and minorities, permeate the public sphere, which is already permeated fully, when they capture state power? That's the question. And this question has 2 types of answers. One is optimistic, and the other is more pessimistic. First, the optimistic one. This rests on a sociological observation that we are now living in a post-Islamist age, of a generation where veiled rappers rub shoulders with punks and where bearded humorists can find something to say to their secular counterparts. And the assumption is surely, this sociological reality must find some kind of political expression. Now, when we look for these political expressions, I'm afraid that the empirical record is threadbare because the only case we are pointed to is the AKP in Turkey.
Keep looking out there. Yeah.
It's the AKP in Turkey. The AKP is not an Islamic republic. It will never become Iran, but it is on a slippery slope to fast becoming alike Putin's Russia. I don't have time to go into why. And I hate to disappoint audiences who are sort of clinging to the perspective that AKP represents a pluralist alternative within an Islamist envelope. So already a little bit guarded about the optimistic scenario. Now for the pessimistic one. And the pessimistic scenario in that case is that, unfortunately, what happens when you, through state power, impose an Islamic normativity, you are forced to draw some red lines. Because if you do not draw these red lines, what precisely qualifies this polity as Islamic? Now, I notice that these red lines always go through the dress and comportment of women. It is women who have to bear the brunt, to give a polity the imprimatur of being really Muslim, recognizably Muslim. Now, this is not because Islam offers fewer resources for feminism, pluralism than other religions, but simply because once you have accepted this as your ground, once you disallow yourself from saying that struggle for women's equality are important struggles of the 20th century, and we can defend this on its own rights, The minute you straitjacket yourself within a doctrinal envelope, you are left to the tender mercies of interpreters who may have less or more enabling interpretations. So what I am afraid of in terms of what happens to the public sphere when you have a government that is not predominantly, but with a large component of a will to transform society into an Islamic society, if not an Islamic state, I do worry about where this places people who are already disempowered, very disempowered, in Mubarak's Egypt. Minorities, the Copts of Egypt, women, and one wonders where further this type of marginalization and disempowerment can go. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Oh. Okay, very good. Let's see if there's anybody who wants a very sharp, specific addition to what we just heard. Rosemary Hollis.
Well, I'm glad that both speakers have debunked the idea that we should be obsessed with the role of the Muslim Brothers in particular, and therefore the potential for Egypt to become a theocracy. I keep feeling it's about economics. And I think, therefore, there's a continuity to this revolution. The great mass of the poor are probably religiously conservative, observant, very baffled and confused, need reassurance that this revolution is going to deliver a better life. And I find it just inappropriate of the rest of us on the outside to get obsessed whether it is a Muslim Brotherhood or a capitalist, liberal, secular party that resembles the British Labour Party that's going to deliver best on a better life for ordinary Egyptians. I think that's what it's really about for Egyptians.
Nabil.
Yes, just to say that this idea that Mubarak's Egypt, or even Sadat's Egypt for that matter, was a secular Egypt, I think is completely wrong, and that this idea that the sinister and indeed the dark forces of the Muslim Brotherhood are going to take over and impose a caliphate or a similar regime over Egypt is also absolutely flawed. I think, if anything, if the Muslim Brotherhood want to win any election, whether parliamentary or presidential in the future, they would have to come up with a platform based on socio-economic reforms, not on a religious agenda.
Not that I don't like consensus, but is there anybody on this panel who is concerned about, or worried, in any way unrelaxed about the Muslim Brotherhood and their role in Egypt? Otherwise, we'll leave it to all of them to be concerned. But what about you, Eugene Rogue?
No, I have no concerns on that ground. I think that the boogeyman has been preoccupying people in the West very much to prop up dictatorships for far too long, and that perhaps we have been overlooking the other forces at play in society and politics. The Muslim Brotherhood it's very clear that they're planning to catch up with a movement that's gone well beyond where they are now, and I don't see them in any way being a threat to the future of Egypt's politics.
All right, perhaps you might want to bear that in mind when you make your optimistic, pessimistic calculations, but pretty well a consensus view here. Let's move on to the last of these themes that we're going to pursue, and then we are, as I've promised, going to get into that wider discussion. This fourth subject is the West's reaction. What should Western governments be doing in response to the events of the last 2 and 3 weeks? Should they be leaning on the new military rulers of Egypt to introduce perhaps at a faster pace, democracy? Should they be making demands now for the wider region beyond Egypt and Tunisia, doing what they can to spread democracy? Or should, as has been the policy in previous decades really, should stability be seen as the goal of Western or foreign governments? To what extent should our governments be willing to trade off what traditionally may have been defined as national interests for the democratic health and well-being of the peoples themselves in the region. So those are just some of the questions. The response is going to come from Rosemary Hollis, but the opening 6 or 7 minutes worth of thoughts on this comes from Roger Cohen.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I think we've lost Ed Luttwak, and I don't know what the defining characteristics of Luttwak's are compared with Cohen's, but I would say that if, as I hope, we're about to see the first peace between an Arab and a Jewish democracy, and that's what's suddenly become possible after these events, I hope that the two of us could celebrate that with some spaghetti alle vongole. Right, Ed? Now, I say to the pessimists among you, and there seems to be quite a lot of you, please, please, just put yourselves in Tahrir Square for a moment, if you can. Try and project yourselves into this vast square overlooked by the Egyptian Museum and the building that houses the labyrinthine Egyptian bureaucracy and by a Ritz-Carlton in the process of construction and various tawdry apartment buildings. A big area, and Egypt found itself, encountered itself in this square. What happened in that square during the time I was there was really quite extraordinary, and I think it spoke to the deep culture of Egyptians. You had an infirmary take form, you had a little detention area, you had a place where speeches were made, you had discussions going the whole time, and in a way I think it was a good thing that Mubarak proved so stubborn, because it left the time for Egyptians to get to know each other. And I just say that one conversation I witnessed in particular between a young Egyptian woman, aged 33, who rushed back from Geneva, where she lives, very westernized, seeing what was happening in Tahrir, and a Brotherhood guy, aged 40, big beard, strong Brotherhood believer, and seeing him tear up and then she break into tears when he described his torture at the hands of Mubarak and then raised his trousers to show this terrible scar. There were all kinds of meetings of that kind, and I think this is a very positive development. What happened? I think the number of people who came up to me and said, we never felt like actors before, we felt like pawns. We never felt we had any dignity. We never felt any action we could take could make any difference. And I think this is something that the West should celebrate, should try to support, because it's the very foundation of a healthy society, and it is also aligns with our values. It's time, as Tariq said, to get over this binary thinking, which says that on the one hand, you have dictatorship, and on the other, you have only Islamic fundamentalism. That binary thinking, I think, is exhausted, and that is what the events of Tunisia and Egypt have shown us. It's important for the West, I think, also to demonstrate, and particularly for the United States, to demonstrate that it doesn't have double standards, irrevocably committed to double standards in the Middle East. You know, what good is it for the United States to support the likes of a regime like Mubarak's? I think it's a very important thing now to get over that and to convince some Arabs that, no, actually we are ready to try to support this democratic experiment. I also think that for the West, you know, if you feel, as I described, that your life has no value, that you're a pawn, that you're just a, you know, a helpless person seeing conspiracies all around you, unable in any way to control your life, I would say that the appeal of violent jihadism, of extremist violence, is much greater to people like that who are in that condition than people who feel that they can change their lives through democratic and representative processes. Now, I think I would give Obama kind of an A-, B+, maybe, through this process. You know, I think he started well, talking about universal rights, making it clear that the time was now for change. There was then a pretty bad kind of wobble in the middle around the time of the Munich Security Conference, where we had various officials saying, including Hillary Clinton, that Mubarak could guide this process. That was never going to fly. It was never going to fly in Tahrir. Nobody believed that the great anti-democrat could be the guy who delivered democracy, or that his henchman, Suleiman, Mr. Renditions, could somehow oversee this great democratic flowering. That wasn't going to fly in Tahrir. And if demand number 1, that Mubarak go, had not been met, then demands 2 through 20 just became completely meaningless. So I think that was a pretty bad wobble in the middle, and I tried to argue in my columns very strongly against it. But at the end, I think Obama did come through and was very eloquent. And I think he realizes that these changes could be a turning point. We don't know yet, but we have, I think, I say to you pessimists, reasons for some optimism. I spoke of the nature of Egypt earlier, so I won't repeat that. But I would say that, we do have some traction, some influence as the West in Egypt that we certainly don't have in Iran, for example. And, maybe $1.3 billion a year does buy you something. You can be damn sure that Gates is going to be Defense Secretary Gates is going to be continuing the 5 conversations at least that he had with Field Marshal Tantawi during these 18 days. You can be very sure that the phone is going to be ringing, every other day from the Pentagon to Tantawi saying, look, and I think the Army's made a good start. They've made, basically, I think, the right moves. I'm a bit skeptical on 6 months for an election. El Baradei favors a year, which I think would be perhaps more realistic if you think about forming political parties, giving those political parties chance to make their pitch for the hearts and minds of Egyptians, revising the constitution. Right now in Egypt, there's no president, no vice president, no constitution, no parliament. This is really being built from the ground up. So I'm not sure if 6 months is enough, but I think the West, America in particular, through the relationships that it has with the armed forces in Egypt, is in a position to push this democratic change ahead. And I think that is a very important thing. We should do this discreetly. As you all know, the West carries a lot of baggage in the Middle East. It begins with colonialism. There's the perception of our support, at least in the United States, for Israel rather than for Arabs, of not being an honest broker, but being more Israel's lawyer than an honest broker. So I think there's a lot to be said for all the West does to be discreet. We should be talking to the army, we should be talking to Egyptians. We shouldn't be banging on the table and saying, you have to deliver democracy within 6 months or that kind of thing. It should be done through discrete channels. People say, what about stability? Aren't we risking losing stability? I don't see that there's been a great deal of stability in the Middle East. So I don't feel we have that much to lose, and we clearly have a lot to gain. And 2 things I would say is that the West should be very careful about 2 things that, in my view, would be disastrous. One is war on Iran. We don't want wars right now in the Middle East. I mean, we've got a process going that was achieved peacefully, thankfully. After all the bloodshed, this was actually achieved peacefully. This peace is important. The peace in Egypt is important. As I said earlier, wars don't tend to create good things. Look at Iraq. So I think it's absolutely critical as this Egyptian process goes forward, that the West avoid finding itself in a war with Iran. And it's very important that the West impress upon Israel that war, another war, say with Lebanon, what does war do? It inflames sentiments. It would inflame sentiments in Egypt. And that would be very negative for this whole process. And I think through whatever channels it can, and I know the pessimists among you will say, what's the point after 62 years, and look how divided the Palestinians are and so on. But, one thing that could really help push Egypt in a very positive direction would be if any serious progress were made between Israel and Palestine. I mean, imagine 20 years from now, Israeli technological know-how, ingenuity, that vast pool of Egyptian labor, the burgeoning Egyptian middle class. I mean, the potential for cooperation is absolutely enormous. Can I conclude? I just conclude, we've got to get over this binary thinking, as I said. Autocracy, fundamentally. The Arab world has changed, the Muslim world has changed, and I'm much less skeptical on Turkey than Denise. But listen to what a Muslim Brotherhood leader said here. Moving forward, we envision the establishment of a democratic civil state that draws on universal measures of freedom and justice, which are central Islamic values. We embrace democracy not as a foreign concept that must be reconciled with tradition, but as a set of principles and objectives that are inherently compatible with and reinforce Islamic tenets. I think that's an important idea to think about. And as I emerged day after day from Tahrir Square through this 2-foot gap between the tanks that surrounded the square, I thought to myself, it would just take one person to panic, the thousands of people behind me, and hundreds of people would have been crushed. The Egyptian people managed to thread themselves through the eye of that needle. I think if we give them time, they can thread themselves through the eye of the needle that leads to some better and more decent society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just speculating whether that Brotherhood member you spoke to had been reading the writings of Tariq Ramadan. It sounded like it. Rosemary Hollis, a 3 or 4 minute response from you, and then it's open.
Okay, I'm not quite on the same page as Roger Cohen over this. And whilst I've said it's inappropriate for us to be telling the Egyptians what would or would not be good for them, mistaking what we mean, what would or would not be good for us, I think the answer to the question, what should the West do, is be very careful. Minimum grand statements. And also, I'm uncomfortable with this idea of discrete influence behind the scenes because the West, quote unquote, or the United States, knows what would be good. We don't have a good track record on this. Think of all those Americans that swarmed to Russia after the overthrow of the Soviet regime to tell them how to run their place. And what a mess that was. Think of Iraq and what a mess that became. And think also of the Palestinians, who are a small enough captive population to have been socially engineered into another mess in terms of the outcome of their elections, which didn't turn out the way we wanted. So I don't think we have a leg to stand on. I think that we mistake our own espousal and practice of democracy for a devotion to its advocacy abroad when our actions belie our words, in the Arab world in particular. I think, yes, we've talked the language of democracy in the 1990s and in the 2000s to the Arabs, but in a half-hearted, patchy, hypocritical way, and contradicted by other actions and policies that we've adopted. We've talked about corruption being a bad thing, torture, detention without trial, and arbitrary arrest, but we've condoned all of those. The Euro-Mediterranean Partnership Initiative, launched in 1995, was supposed to engender and support economic and political reform in North Africa. It fell short of aspirations for political liberalization. And the economic liberalization widened the gap between the rich and the mass of the poor, hence the revolutions we're now seeing. So how should we proceed? I think we have to ask now the following 4 questions. How can any Egyptian government reverse the economic fortunes of ordinary Egyptians? And without this, the promise of democracy will not address all the grievances. I think the spectre of 80 million people for whom economic liberalization has made only a few rich, how you turn that around, there's going to be so much disappointment along the way. I think, secondly, we have to ask, what stakes do Western governments have in the economic status quo across the region? And how easily will the West adjust to change in Europe, in the United States, with the repercussions of a fairer, more equitable distribution of wealth in the Arab world? And let's not forget the scarcity of resources. Are there enough for everybody to have the level of consumption that we would like to see them get through freedom? Third question, what will democracy mean for Western influence in the region? And if it means that Western influence in the region is lessened, will we say bravo? Or will we say they chose the wrong lot? And lastly, can the West and will the West revisit our own policies? Because we can't claim to be on the right side or the future of the region in light of this revolution unless we're prepared to say we were wrong and we're prepared to change along with you. It's not all up to you with us giving nice advice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a note there. I'll come to that in a second. So our four very concisely and sharply discussed themes: what kind of revolution, the question of Israel, what role for the Islamists, and how the West should react. I think there's been material there, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. On the optimistic side of the ledger, you might say this was a young revolution, a Twitter, Facebook revolution, that the prospects of a war with Israel, everybody agreed, including Edward Luttwak over there, that was very unlikely, that the Islamists were no bogeyman of the imagination, and that there is things that the West can do, albeit discreetly. And on the pessimistic side of the ledger, you heard that notion that everything that's going on is uncertain, that the cold peace with Israel could get even colder, that there is the precedent of 1979 and Iran for what begins as a apparently democratic or secular revolution anyway, becoming something rather different. And finally, the thought there from Rosemary Hollis, which I paraphrase, my words, not hers, that for all our good intentions, we should probably butt out, because last time we got involved, we made a bit of a mess. So optimists or pessimists, there's lots for you to bite on there. I'm now going to throw it open on this format. I'm going to take questions in sort of groups. Keep the hands up, and if we get the microphone first of all to the gentleman here, and I'll get the next microphone in position for the lady here. So we'll hear from you, and there's people upstairs. I'm not going to discriminate against you. You'll be next after that. So we'll take 3 or 4. Yeah. Oh, it was actually the man I know there, but never mind, you're there. You know.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My question is to say thank you to the panel for their comprehensive view and discussion. But it's clear that pragmatism is needed if the Israelis, if the Egyptians are going to make a go of getting some sort of political constitution together. And I would just like to say, did anyone read a rather brilliant little article in the Herald Tribune on Saturday about proposing that the Turkish constitution is something that one should look closely at, because it is a secular state where...
I'm just going to interrupt a little bit, because I should have said this at the beginning. We're not going to have time for quite long sort of disquisitions. We need to go to a sharp point or question.
It's a secular state where the no religious influence is allowed, and on the other hand, the politicians are allowed to get on without that influence. The army plays an important part, and this was seen a few weeks ago, months ago, when there was a tendency for an Islamist influence to come in, and the army just put its pressure in.
I think we're going to wind it up there.
And this is a rather pragmatic solution. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to, sorry, we'll go to there. If you pass the microphone along to the gentleman that's been waiting there, it's got to be much shorter than that, I'm afraid, and come right to a focus as soon as we can. Yeah.
Avi?
Lady there. No, I'm pointing up at the lady there, standing by the microphone. Yeah. There we go. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. Last week, Tony Blair said that Mubarak was immensely courageous and a force for good. Once Mubarak had resigned, he said this was a pivotal moment for democracy in the Middle East. Can
Tony
there
Blair.
really be seen as a credible envoy for peace in the Middle East?
Thank you. Thank you. Passing no judgment on the content, that is exactly how I need questions to be asked, so thank you very much indeed. Lady here, yeah. And you're going to be next after we've heard him.
In this discussion, no mention has been made of leaders likely to emerge. Two parts of this question. Is this a good thing? And secondly, who do you think they are likely to be?
Thank you. So sort of runners and riders to take over. Well, let's go to you next, yeah.
Yeah, hello, thank you. I'm wondering if I'm the only person in the audience who's wondering about the substance of the talk tonight compared with the title, because there's been a huge amount of talk about Egypt. I have to say, when I came here this evening, I was looking at all the sort of the wider picture. 2-3 weeks ago, there was a lot of talk about contagion, Tunisia, Egypt being the beginning of revolution across the Middle East. I haven't really heard much talk about that, and I'm very interested to know what the panel thinks about what next.
Let's get to, we absolutely, I hope this last section will be a lot on that. Very helpful. Thank you. Yes, you've been waiting very patiently, yeah. I'll take two more after this, yeah.
The Friday sermon by the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia termed the protesters in Tahrir Square as the enemies of Islam. And which reminded me of the statement of Hillary Clinton about a year ago in New York Times that Saudi Arabia remains the significant donor to Sunni terrorism in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
Okay.
So I would suggest that the threat to the revolution in Egypt is not as much from Israel as it is from our friends in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Good. Okay, we'll take one more. Let's get the microphone, if we can, to the people right at the back on this ground floor. And while we're doing that, we'll hear from you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I am myself Egyptian, and I think I'm myself an Egyptian, and I would like to speak about it from the point of view of an insider. Of course, I'm a Democrat. I mean, I lived what everyone has lived during the past 18 days. My son-in-law was sitting in Tahrir Square. My son was in Egypt trying to get to Tahrir Square. Well, and of course, I mean, what I'm very concerned at this point is what's going to happen next. Okay. Like Tariq has very well defended the right of the Muslim Brotherhood to play a role, some sort of role in the coming future. But my question to you, Tariq, is, I mean, well, I lived in Egypt in the past 15, 16, 17 years. Yep. And the Egyptian society had become extremely intolerant. I'm not talking about the past few years, the past 18 days where people were chanting, bearded people were chanting in Tahrir Square with secular forces. I'm talking about what the role the Muslim Brotherhood could play in the coming period, because they will certainly play a role as a force to spread tolerance in the Egyptian society, which is very much needed. I'm not talking about 2 weeks ago,
and you're skeptical of that, are you?
I am, of course, because well, I've lived in Egypt for the past 17 years.
And you're skeptical of their ability to foster tolerance.
Well, I hope they will. They can be progressive if they want.
Sorry to do this.
But there will be there will be needed a very strong political will from the Muslim Brotherhood to play the force of moderate forces in Egypt.
Tariq is barracking me here. Let's go for the last person here. Yeah.
Thanks, first of all, for the panel. Quick question is, what do you expect is going to unfold in the GCC countries?
The Gulf countries, you're speaking about it. Good. Well, let's put that together with the question that was asked, and I sympathize with the gentleman, I think, up there who wants to hear about the spread beyond just Egypt. Let's start with you, Eugene Rogan, on the spread. We'll come back to Egypt issues, but I want to hear you talk about how likely, etc., you believe it is the genie might be out of the bottle in the wider region, and you can take in the Gulf from that last question.
Excellent question. It's what everyone's been really talking about since the Tunisian example was set. I've got a couple of observations. One, it's very interesting how Arab affairs influence Arabs. You had revolutions in Eastern Europe in 1989, and of course they made an impact. But it wasn't an Arab movement, and it didn't take off the same way. I think the fact that you had these events in Tunisia inspired people specifically across the Arab world to address the things they thought were wrong with their own political systems. And it's in that they will set off an influence. We haven't talked much about Tunisia. But I think the role that Tunisia plays is key, because they are setting the high water mark that people across the Arab world will aspire to in terms of achieving freedom from dictators and establishing a democratic order. Thirdly, I think every Arab state is insecure against its own people. There was one sign in Tahrir Square saying, people shouldn't fear their governments, governments should fear the people. And it's definitely the message of the moment. So whether they're going to throw a lot of benefits and try and loosen up their political systems to preempt a revolutionary moment in countries like Algeria or Syria or Jordan or Bahrain, or whether in fact we see the people mobilize and topple their governments, as seems to be a genuine risk in places like Yemen, remains to be seen. But I think this year we'll see a series of further actions. It's the beginning, not the end, of the revolutionary year of 2011.
Thank you very much. We read today that in Bahrain they were using the very same slogan that was used in Tahrir Square about "we want the regime to fall." So that sense of spread. Nabila, do you see, your report all across this region? Is there going to be a domino effect like there was in Europe, Eastern Europe in 1989?
Well, certainly the Mubarak's resignation and the overthrow of Tunisia's leader have certainly electrified the Arab world, and I was following closely what was happening in Algeria, being Algerian myself, and it's what's happened in Tunisia, which is of course a neighboring country, certainly inspired pro-democracy groups, but also human rights activists to take to the streets and try to topple a sinister regime. I think it's going to be slightly trickier in Algeria to achieve that, given that they have the highest number of police officers per capita in the world. Algeria has had a more turbulent, a more violent history, 132 years of colonization, a very bloody war of independence. Algeria only became independent in 1962, a solid decade of a bloody civil war in the 1990s. And dare I say, Algeria has this problem with a very serious problem with Islamic and terrorist groups, and the security state is designed to deal with that kind of fundamentalist group. So you can just imagine the violence that they're going to use against ordinary people trying to demonstrate and bring about change in their own country. Just to give you an example of the ruthlessness of the security forces, when 2,000 demonstrators gathered on May the 1st Square last Saturday, 30,000 riot police were sent to deal with them. In one afternoon, 1,000 people were arrested, put in jail, and the matter was over.
That's got to be the point, hasn't it, Roger Cohen, that actually, instead of a domino effect, it could be the reverse effect, that the regimes around the region think, now we know what we've got to stop, and they take steps to stop it.
Well, they're not doing a very good job up to now, Jonathan. I mean, what do you want to define a domino effect? I mean, within 11 days of Tunisia happening on Jan 14, on Jan 25, there was the first big demonstration in Egypt, and now you've had the most populous Arab state and traditionally the hub, even if it's been somnolent for quite a while, but the hub of the Arab world, Mubarak falling. So yeah, I think the genie's out the bottle, and that doesn't mean that it's going to happen immediately anywhere else, but that's the direction things are moving. And what you have everywhere, I think, including Iran, are regimes and societies that have lost touch with each other. You have overwhelmingly young populations, they're connected, they want their share of modernity, and you have Brezhnevian figures like Khamenei, or in the Arab world, Gaddafi, these sort of figures out of some kind of Arab Jurassic Park. And hopefully, you know, we're closing that park right now. I mean, that's, you know, people have had enough of that particular park. I think in the Gulf states, you know, it's a little different. I mean, there's a lot of money. And with money, you know, you can work to avert these things. And I think it's interesting, fine point, you know, if you look at the history of, you know, the Middle East, Arab world, I mean, contagion is quite prevalent. I mean, with Nasserism, you know, boom, after the 1952 coup, and, you know, nationalist secularism, boom, it spread right across the Middle East. When that collapsed, you know, after the '67 war and then after the Iranian Revolution, you had a wave of Islamism. And, you know, maybe freedom to connectism can be equally infectious.
Thank you. I want to, because there are other questions, I want to, who here would like to address the question of Tony Blair? I'm going to put that to Rosemary Hollis. Tony Blair, quick U-turn on Mubarak, and therefore not eligible or not fit, not suitable to be the Middle East envoy. Just a quick answer on that, and then there's other things I want to make sure we cover, because these were the questions that were asked.
I think the quartet has turned out to be an invention to place consensus between the members of the quartet ahead of resolution of the conflict. I think Tony Blair has performed the role magnificently to that job description, and if the quartet role is to be given more power, please not to him.
Thank you. Tariq Ramadan addressed the question that came from the lady Egyptian up there, who said that not judging by the last 18 days, but years and years and years, she was at least had some questions about whether tolerance was going to be the new mood in the country.
Yes, if I just may say something about just this, what we just heard about Tony Blair and our responsibility. I think that if we are all here, it's not only as spectators of what is going on in the Middle East, it's a very serious matter here. It's the voice from the West and what we have to say as citizens in the West, because it's very important. Our governments in Europe, especially in Europe, were very silent. Very silent. It's not only Tony Blair is silent to support. The first one to support the people in Egypt was the Danish government 4 days ago. So think about it. It's just a voice where what you were saying about we have to be very careful with the Western voices, that's true, but it's not going to happen like this. I think that if we listen to the Barack Obama's voice during the whole process, we may think that he was clumsy something. I don't think so. It was a very clever following of the whole process. I think that we heard him saying things that from the beginning, by the way, in Tunisia, he was the first to praise the people by saying they are courageous. And I think that they are playing. So for us from the West, it's really important to know where we sit, where we stand when it comes to our principles in the West. And also to understand that we are not only talking about democracy, we are also talking about economics. And here there is something which is quite important, that Mubarak and his son became to be a liability for many, economic interests and also for transnational corporations. We don't have to be naive on this. This is a factor which is also important. So where we stand on this, it's important. And what you were saying, I think, about the Muslim Brotherhood and the role, I think that I completely agree. I don't think that we have to idealize anything which has to do with an Islamic movement, an Islamist movement, and a Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. What is important for me is to look at what happened over the last 30 years. Now we can think it's only pragmatism and strategies, or we can think that they have been changing a great deal over the last 30 years. And if we listen to the quotation that you just read, they are changing, and the Islamists and the mainstream nonviolent Islamists, they are changing. So the only way for us is to challenge their views, ask for the political debates that are the principle of democracies. And I think that this is the only way forward, not to demonize them, but to challenge their views. And there is something which is important here. When they are telling we are willing to go for democracy. Democracy is a principle, is not only a principle, it's a system that we respect. Let them be challenged. And once again, for example, whatever you think of Erdogan after Erbakan, it changes, and all the movement changes because of democratic processes and being involved in the discussion, not under the repression. And I think that this is a principle which is so important. We have to be serious about that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm only cutting off the applause because I just want to get as much in as I can. There's two more questions that I still have not yet been addressed. I'm going to get those. Then we'll do another round, and I'm aware that our minutes are running out and people have places to go. So one very good question was on Saudi Arabia, and Denise, you want to address that?
Yes, I think that, a rather sanitized version of the positions of the West, etc., have been offered so far. The West has first given us the Cold War policies that completely leveled the political playing field by eliminating any liberal or leftist tendencies, leaving only Islamist actors standing. Then we had the liberalization policies and infitah, which went further by taking the state out of the equation and enabling the total capture of civil society, social welfare, etc., by Islamist actors. Now, this being the situation, it didn't happen overnight, we have to ask ourselves, where was some of the momentum for all this coming? And I think the elephant sitting in the room, if I may say so, is Saudi Arabia. Because by their own admission, even the Muslim Brotherhood, which started out, was extensively Salafized as a result of various influences emanating from certain quarters. So now we have a very paradoxical situation. We have a situation whereby, and incidentally that was true about Islamist tendencies in Turkey too, to a certain extent. They were bankrolled, there was a press, etc. But now look at the paradox. They have nurtured movements which are threatening to show democratic tendencies and to now want to go through the ballot box, the irony of ironies.
Okay, thank you. It slows us down, actually, when you applaud, but it's your call. We had a question about leaders. The word hadn't come up much. Runners and riders, Roger Cohen, you were there. And I know you interviewed Mohammed el-Baradei. What do you think's likely future presidents in Egypt?
Well, it's the nature of regimes like this that you don't, until they open up, you don't know, who's there, kind of thing. I mean, look at Gonzalez or something in Franco's Spain. But clearly Ammar Moussa is, I heard a lot of respect for him, and he's said he's stepping down from being Secretary General of the Arab League. Among the business community, I think some of the middle classes, there's respect for the current Prime Minister who rejigged Egypt Air, and seems, I heard more positive things about him than I expected to. I think el-Baradei is, he doesn't have much of a base in Egypt. He told me he wants to be more of an éminence grise than actually put himself in the fray to be president. But I think it's also very important to get some kind of rainbow coalition type thing going. There's so many presences in Tahrir, Wael Ghoneim's generation, all that, the women who were there, Copts. It's very important to try and make this process, I think, as all-embracing as possible going forward.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do is take a last round of very, very short, concise, brilliantly worded questions, and then we're going to come back here for equally concise final answers, and that will be it. I'm going to try and get as many of you in as possible. This is going to require athleticism by our microphone holders. Can you go to the person there? Yep, to the young man there. While that's happening, you've got somebody there. And then we'll take them in order there. Good.
Thank you. My question is short and simple. There's been quite a lot of talk of the domino effect regarding the Arab turmoil. And my question is simply, who's next?
Who's next? Thank you. Nice, concise question. Up there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to address a presupposition I felt had been throughout the whole debate. And it's just, do we consider democracy, however you defined it, to be the pinnacle of human governance, or are all its imperfections, and I think we'll agree there are many imperfections, simply being overlooked by virtue of we don't have any better solution?
Good, nice brief topic for the end of the evening. I always like that. Let's go to the person over, where are they? Who's next? You've got it, yeah. Thank you very much, yeah. Go on.
One of the things that should we be saying it's turmoil? Should we be saying it's a crisis or a turmoil? I mean, surely we should be celebrating that, Egypt has got rid of a police Stasi-like dictator and they might be able to sort something out with their own lives. And should we still go and visit the pyramids?
Thank you. Up there, yeah.
Just a question on the risk of a monetary liquidity crisis, how they are going to address it, the problem of capital flight, potential capital flight, and how are they going to save the tourist season, which is vital to the liquidity of the monetary system. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've had two things on the tourism industry. Yes, you've got somebody over there. Yeah.
I'd like to thank the panel for urging me in the direction of born-again optimism. But I just wonder if we need to guard against our own exhilaration. I think Rosemary Hollis's point about delivering economic benefits to the masses is critical. And I'd like to ask what the perspective on this will be in the Iran leadership, and whether if the economic deliverance doesn't take place, that could change over a period of 10 to 20 years.
Okay, thank you. So, Iran, you've got somebody there, yeah.
My question is, what is the significance of the role women played in Tunisia and Egypt, and what kind of future role will they play in the political process?
Specifically in Egypt or elsewhere?
Or in the region.
In the region, okay. When you can, there's two people there. If you go back behind there, we'll take you quickly if we can. And the lady next to you, yeah.
Hello. I want to put what's happening now in Egypt and Tunisia in the context of David Cameron's hypocritical and selective speech when he joined Merkel in his blaming of Islamism and multiculturalism for the violent extremism here in the West, rather than attributing it to their double standards of their bellicose foreign policy and their backing of brutal Arab dictators. Do you think in the light, or maybe in the darkness of this superficial analysis and this scapegoating argument and their obsessions about the Islamism, that do you really think that these leaders will care about the fate and the democratic aspirations of the people in these regions?
Okay, thank you. And you can see there's just more hands than we're going to be able to get, but you've got somebody right next to you there, lady there, just behind you. Let's have that because the microphone's there.
It's estimated that at the time of the Tunisian revolution, about 10% of the population had access to Facebook. How will the other 90% be served? And will the traditional media be forced to change and open up, reflecting revolutionary sentimentality?
Thank you. Well, that's interesting. What about the people who are not connected on social networks? Yeah, let's take a couple there, and then that will probably have to be it, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Hello. My question for Dr. Tariq Ramadan regarding Muslim Brotherhood, which seems to me mutation and PR without a change of heart. If they're going to be a political party, would they accept a Christian to be their leader or chairman or atheist? And what about the Sharia? Would they accept the Sharia as a core principle of this political movement?
I'm not sure I got all of that, but I know you're asking about the Muslim Brotherhood as a political party. I think there were. Did you get the rest of that question? Because you did. Tariq did, so he's going to respond to it. And the last one is going to be here because you've had your hand up for a long time. And we're so sorry that you're out of time, but we could just be here all night, clearly. Yeah.
Good evening. So I am still a pessimist.
Pessimist, okay.
I feel that Mubarak was only able to stay in power because of the army. The army are now in power. Why would the army want to hand their power to any form of democracy? Mubarak was in power because of...
Why would they give up their power for democracy? Absolutely. Right, fine. So many questions there. You've all heard them. These will be your closing remarks, panelists. Just to refresh your memory, the very first question was, who's next? We did have a question whether we are overrating democracy. Should we say this is a crisis or should it be something we celebrate? What about Iran if the economy and growth does not pan out? The role of women in the future? David Cameron's speech on Islamism. What about those not connected by social networks? The Muslim Brotherhood, a political party, and how about the army? Let's go in this order. Rosemary Hollis, we'll start with you.
There's going to be no more sons taking over from their fathers in the republics. That's what's next. And it's going to be the turmoil in the title. I don't think it's going to work out the same way in every single Arab country, but the repercussions will be felt in every Arab country, and in some cases it's going to be bloody and protracted. But then historians won't look back on it as a real revolution if it doesn't take some more violence, I'm afraid.
Wow, very sharp thought there. Roger Cohen, any one of those last topics you want to address, including who's next?
I don't know who's next, but I do know that one day Iran will get a government worthy of its people's now centennial quest for some form of representative government. This too will pass. Democracy, well, I think the last decade was a great decade for authoritarianism in various forms. So I think it's terrific that this one is beginning with democracy making a bit of a comeback.
Thank you. Deniz, what do you want to take from there? The role of women was something you had touched on, and the question was,
yes.
What about the role of women in the future?
Well, I think, obviously women have been there, they were present, they were pro-democracy, they were extremely militant. The question is, as in every momentous change of this kind, whether their aspirations for equality and a better future will be dashed. It was certainly dashed in the democratic transitions of Eastern Europe. Let us hope that it does not have the same fate in a democratic moment in the Middle East, because there are various ways in which women's rights and democratization can be on a collision course. And there are some elements of that which at the moment, in the heat of euphoria, we don't very much like to look at. But I personally think that none of the governments are really sociologically able to translate the aspirations of their own people. And frankly, in terms of modernization, etc., I would have thought that Iran would be next, but this is not very likely.
All right, thank you very much. Tariq and Ramadan, there were a couple of questions, I think, directed at you, partly about whether the Muslim Brotherhood would actually organise as a political party, and also perhaps David Cameron's speech, which did touch on Islamism, just as these revolutions are unfolding.
Yes, quite quickly. Just something about democracy, because I think that it's important. Even in the Islamist statements for years, we have heard at the beginning of the 20th century people rejecting democracy and coming back to it now, and even in Turkey, some were saying they were against. So I think that there is something which is important for us is from where we are is to be quite clear on the principles that we are promoting and not to impose the models. So when we say about rule of law, equal rights, equality, universal suffrage, accountability and separation of power, these are principles, but now the models that are going to be implemented, you cannot impose them from here. It has to come from a dynamic within the country, and I think that this is what the people are asking. Independency is, we agree on the principles, let us find our model. So I think that this is an important discussion. The second thing is very important. I'm very optimistic, but still what we have now, and what you said, Regine, is very important. Still the army is taking over, and I think that we have to be very cautious about what could happen, because it's still the army, and this is something which is the people who are there were within the system before. They are representing the regime. So Mubarak is not there, but the regime is there. And very quickly about the Muslim Brotherhood, what you are asking, these are critical questions, and you are right to ask them. And I think that what we had from people saying, I would have told you about, 20 years ago, they would have said no to women and no to Christians. Now they are changing. Is this a strategic take, or is it genuine? Is it sincere from within? I think that this is where they have to enter into the discussion about their understanding and their definition of Sharia. And by the way, not all the Muslim brothers have the same definition. There are tensions and a gap generation on what is Sharia, what is the starting point. Now the point for me is to look at Tahrir Square and to have people coming from the Coptic, the Muslims, and being together. And I think that this is where we have to start, and to challenge anything which has to do with a narrow vision. It doesn't mean, once again, I'm saying that these are fair questions to be asked on equality, on pluralism within the society, but it cannot be done only by challenging them. And the last question is about multiculturalism and what we got. I was saying at the beginning, it's very important for us from the West and from Europe to take a stand on this. Because what we have now is some of our leaders sometimes using what is happening in Muslim majority countries to let us think that Muslims and British Muslims, they have a problem with democracy. In fact, it's the other way around. Millions of European Muslims are showing they don't have a problem with democracy. And now this is the new we that I am advocating, us standing for our principles and showing that we are democrats and we abide by our standards and principles here to say we support the Egyptian when they ask for the same rights as us. Not the other way around, and to shed suspicion on the Muslims because we are dealing with dictators there. I think that this is really a short-sighted policy, and this is why I'm very much, in this speech that I heard some Muslims praising this speech, saying, yes, he's asking the good questions, not at the right time, and not starting from the right principles, which is look at your citizens. The Muslim British citizens are democrats, and they are showing it every day, and this is where they will join what is happening in Egypt, in Tunisia, and elsewhere. I think we have to change our vision of what is happening.
Thank you. Really closing seconds from both of you. Nabila, the question still hanging out there is who's next? And perhaps you might want to address this point also. I'm going to put it to Eugene too, about social networks. What about the 90%, perhaps older people not on Twitter, etc.?
Well, the question of who's next certainly remains uncertain, but what's for sure is that any sudden regime change is rarely followed by a period of stability, and that is the case, it applies to any country, and in that respect, Egypt is no exception. But I also think that the stability argument, which is used to maintain all despots in place, is far from impressive for all the reasons that Roger Cohen and Tariq Ramadan have formulated. And let's not forget that Mubarak himself, before stepping down, had expressed his alleged fear of chaos if he leaves. Now, that's the classic default position of any dictator, and the cautious and self-interested US was propagating this idea at every opportunity. Now, these countries in the Arab world need major political and social reforms to make them more democratic. They do not need to be propped up by wary Western powers which fear instability. The second point I would like to address is the media. I think one of the fascinating aspects that applies to the revolution in Tunisia and in Egypt is that who would have thought that the greatest threats to dictatorships would come from Twitter and Facebook and more generally from the internet. So I think that's a fascinating development. As far as the traditional media is concerned, I think we're already witnessing some sort of change in Egypt. For example, the independent newspaper Masri al-Yawm has dared to, put some daring headlines. There's also a change of tone in the state-controlled TV channels. So I'm quite optimistic about changes in the future towards more freedom of speech and indeed less censorship. The last point I would like to address is regarding the role of women. Well, at the center of my revolution, the 1919 revolution in Egypt, I looked very closely at the role of women, the role that women played in the revolution. And for the first time, women stepped out of their home to join men and other women from the countryside to bring about a change in the country and, as it were, end an era of colonization. And in recent events in Egypt, we've also seen women with or without hijab, with or without niqabs demonstrating on the street. And that's a very optimistic sign. I was listening to an interview given by Nawal al-Saadawi, who's an Egyptian human rights activist, and she's also a novelist. Yeah. She stood for presidency in 2005. No, for obvious reasons, it didn't go anywhere. She has a regular column in Al-Masri al-Yawm, and in her column next Tuesday, she will put forward the names of some women activists she met on Tahrir Square, and these women are totally ready to get involved in the democratic process to try and shape the future of the country.
Thank you very much. We've got our upcoming show of hands on optimists and pessimists. The optimists are clearly so confident they're going to win. There are already many of them leaving the room. Final thought from Eugene Rogan, particularly this thing about who's next, if you can, and then we're going to have our little show of hands and we'll say thank you and that will be it.
Sounds good. Look, who knows? I mean, that's the fun of it. Who among you would have thought Tunisia first? Even the White House said the odds of Egypt going were only 20%. We've seen, I mean, I read the newspaper, so do you. We've seen trouble crop up in lots of places, but who knows? And that's the excitement of 2011.
Thank you. The perfect note on which to end. Perfect. Thank you. After everything you've heard, if you remain at bottom an optimist about the future of the Middle East, please raise your hand. If after everything you've heard you feel pessimistic about the future of the Middle East, raise your hand. You can see for yourself, I think, again, the optimists edge it. The overall mass of numbers is probably slightly down. But I'm sure it only remains for me, and I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking our stellar panel, Eugene Rogan, Nabila Ramdani, Tariq Ramadan, Denise Candiotti, Roger Cohen, Rosemary Hollis, Edward Lutwak. Thank you all. Thank you. Thanks very much.